Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado, welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
And I'm Kat.
And this week we're excited because we get to talk about our study animal of interest.
Finally.
And it goes well because it piggybacks off of the last week where we got to talk about a harbor porpoise paper, our last episode. But this wasn't just our choice, even though it seemed like it might be because, it's our animal. But we did put the poll up. It was against the spotted dolphin, which is another species that I've studied quite intensively in my career. And so it was very interesting. It was quite close for a while.
I know, it got closer. I was like, oh, it's a slam dunk harbor porpoise. And then it was like all of a sudden those sneaky little votes started coming in.
It was like 14-3. And we're like, wow, okay, I guess it's harbor porpoise. And then it was like, I think it was like 17-14 or something like that at the end. So thank you all for voting. And thank you for choosing the harbor porpoise. Although spotted dolphin would have been fun as well. So we've talked a little bit about the harbor porpoise already in some of the other papers that we've done, and we did do some episodes on the papers that we've done, but we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what we know about these guys. And so I'm going to start off, and you may be noticing if you're a regular listener that Trevor's not here. Trevor is super busy. He's out on the water almost every single day as a naturalist, and there's a lot going on. So he's taking a break for the month, and I think he should be back next time. So we're going to fill in his shoes, and Kat and I will take over his sections.
Thankfully, he left us with an easy one for us. So
yes, it's like, all right, well, we know a little bit about these guys. So.
I mean, hopefully.
Yeah, right. Well, we do and we don't, right? And we'll talk about that.
Good point.
So I'm going to talk about their appearance first. And so these guys are the second smallest cetacean in the world. The only thing smaller is the Vaquita. And we should honestly do one about the Vaquitas.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we did a part one before, but yeah, there's very few animals left. It's one of the most endangered. I think it is the most endangered.
I think at this point it is.
Yeah, there's only about 10 left in the world. So anyway, that's the smallest cetacean, and the next up is harbor porpoise. So there's a possibility that the harbor porpoise could become the smallest cetacean if the Vaquita don't make it, but we're hoping that doesn't happen. So they're small, so they're about 5.5 feet, about 150 pounds, like 135 to 170 pounds. So I always kind of say it's like an average smaller human size, but they are kind of short and squat. So as most porpoises are, they're not long and slender and svelte. They are kind of more piggy.
And I have, put a pin in that. Great lead-in.
One of the names.
We'll find out.
So they're basically portly. And the one thing so a main difference between dolphins and porpoises, which will help us get a visual of these guys. So the main thing is that dolphins generally have a snout or a rostrum or a beak, we call it. It's basically their mouth. But porpoises don't. They have that more blunt face. If you think of a killer whale, which is actually a dolphin, so one of the exceptions to the rules of a dolphin having a rostrum, but that kind of blunt face is what all porpoises have, all the 7 species that there are. So they have this blunt face. They have a smaller triangular dorsal fin. It's more shark-looking like than a curved falcate dorsal fin that you see in a dolphin. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing between dolphins and porpoises is that porpoises are generally a bit more solitary or smaller groups, and dolphins. Whoa, dolphins.
New plural, dolphins.
Dolphins. I like it though. They are found in larger groups and a bit more gregarious and social, but we're again put a pin in that because we're going to talk about sociality with these guys and what we know. So that's the main differences between dolphins and porpoises. So they got that blunt face, triangular fin. Those are going to be the most obvious things that you're going to see. For harbor porpoises, they are kind of dark gray, and maybe Kat's going to talk about some of the other names that they're called. because they're dark and small. But they have kind of a darker gray on top, sometimes to like a dark brown, or it's kind of brown grayish depending on the animal. And we do see some variation in that, of animals that are quite distinctly gray and some that are more kind of muddy. And then they have kind of this, along the lateral line, they have this, it melds into being more white on the bottom. So they have that counter shading, which is pretty typical, but not black and white like an orca or a Dall's porpoise. So darker gray, lighter white, and then they have this little stripe from the pec fin up to the mouth, which is like a little, and I think they also say it's like a chin
strap, I think.
Like, well, that's the chin strap, but yeah, just underneath they have like a little bit darker coloration kind of under the chin area. And we'll talk about the well, I'll just talk about it now. So that coloration pattern that's on the side, that goes from the dark to the light, is actually distinctive per individual. And that's something that we've just kind of, well, there's a paper many, many years ago that said this is individually distinct based on stranded animals, but they're so hard to take photographs of, and they're so small, and they seemingly don't have markings like dolphins do, where they have the nicks and scars in the dorsal fin and stuff. So nobody's really been like, you know what, I'm going to try to photo ID these porpoises. That's a great idea. And also with old film, it would be you couldn't do it. The cost would be too much. You'd have to, develop all that slide film, and then one out of every, 50 might be usable. So until the advent of digital photography and some crazy people like us that are like, yeah, this is really hard, let's go try and do that. It's awesome. So we and another group in California at Golden Gate, they're now at the Marine Mammal Center, started doing photo ID on these animals, and that's what we use. We use that pigmentation pattern on the side, the scars that can unfortunately accumulate on individuals, and then the shape and stuff of their dorsal fin. We also use those as indicators as well. So that is kind of a new thing that's in the research for harbor porpoises, is photo ID, which was not done before. And there's more groups now that are coming out and going, oh yeah, you know what, we can get, with the zoom lenses, we can get some good pictures of these guys and be able to photo ID them. So so we can do that with the coloration patterns they have on the side of the animals along with their dorsal fin. So I think that's about it for their appearance.
Yeah, I think so.
They're cute.
Yeah, I know that they're which I'll talk about in just a moment, but actually this kind of leads in nicely, is I know that there are some phenotypic differences between the majority of harbor porpoises and I think specifically the Black Sea harbor porpoises. Yeah, they look a little bit different. I think they're a little darker, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. And I think that's one where it's like you would be looking at the two comparatively, you could see them more easily than if you would just look at it by itself.
Sure. Yeah.
And there is females are slightly larger than males. A dark gray chin patch, that's what they called it.
There you go.
So there's the lines on the side, and then there are a little patch of dark on the chin. But the females are slightly larger than males, but again, that's like in the averages, right? Like it's like, okay, well, an average, these guys are like, 5 inches bigger than those guys. So you would not be able to look in the water and go, that's a female, like you can for like a California male sea lion. Well, that's a male, obviously. So that's the appearance. So now you're gonna have the distribution.
Yeah, so let's talk about where we find these guys. So harbor porpoises are found in northern temperate and subarctic waters. They're also found in some Arctic coastal and offshore waters as well. So they do typically prefer the coastal areas though, so hence the name harbor porpoise. Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting, is only recently that they found some weird guys that are like, we're in the offshore in deep Atlantic waters. Yeah, it's pretty unusual. That was like 2017, I think, was the paper that came out in. So yeah, that was pretty interesting. Mostly these guys, you're going to find them in like bays, estuaries, harbors, fjords, within a few miles from shore. Yeah, and it's pretty much, they seem to like depth of about less than 650 feet. So it's very oddly quite specific. And then, like you said, you do have these outliers who, for some reason, are going farther offshore, possibly following the food. So in the North Atlantic Sea, we're talking basically they range from Western Greenland all the way across to North Carolina on the US East Coast.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I saw that. I was like, what? And I saw that it goes all the way to basically the top of Florida. You know, and when I talked to some researchers over in North Carolina, they were like, basically, I think it was Cape Hatteras. Like they don't come farther south than that. But even above that, like it's not very rare. It's not very common to find harbor porpoises in that more southern range.
This is the thing with ranges is like technically they can be found there. It doesn't mean they're there frequently, right? So it's can be a little misleading. And then they are also found from the Barents Sea down to West Africa as well. And then in the North Pacific, which is obviously the side that we're on here in Washington, they're found from Japan north up to the Chukchi Sea, which I have a hard time saying, and from Central California all the way up to the Beaufort Sea or the Beaufort Sea.
Yeah, and there's we'll reference back to a bunch of the another group, which is that one Marine Mammal Center in California in San Francisco Bay. So that's one of the ones that's a very good population that is being studied. So just FYI. Yeah,
for sure. And these guys are not found in the Southern Hemisphere at all. So they are specifically a Northern Hemisphere species.
I thought that was interesting because there are usually lots of times it's mirrored, right? You have them up there and you have them down here.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good point. I know I was kind of expecting to like, oh, this is something that I probably didn't know. There's this random Southern Hemisphere population. No, doesn't exist.
Up there.
And harbor porpoises are split into several different stocks, what they call stocks, like management stocks, based on their geographic locations. So for us here in doing our research in Northern Washington, our harbor porpoises are considered part of the Washington Inland Waters stock, which we'll refer back to a little bit later in the status section. But just to be aware of, that's kind of how these guys are split into kind of management units, or in terms of referring to different populations. They're all considered
different
part of the same
regions will
population.
have different little stocks. So if everywhere from California up to here, I think there's like 6 or stocks or something like that. So it's like Northern California and Southern Oregon, and then whatnot. Right.
So kind of how we delineate populations without being able to make a distinction between the species at all. It's like, okay, it's all the same species, but they're living in these different areas.
Right. And a lot of times that's based on genetics, usually mostly on genetics. And we'll talk about that in the behavior section as well.
Yeah, genetics and geography, basically, which lead into each other.
Right.
So that's pretty much the distribution section. So let's take a quick break maybe, and then we'll get into the behavior and diet.
And we're back. Hope you had a good break. We had a nice little chat during our break. So now we're going to go into the diet and behavior. And so I'm going to put an asterisk on this because part of the reason why we're researching harbor porpoises is because we still don't know so much. I like to kind of say that, where we were 30 years ago with dolphins is where we are now with porpoises, where people are starting to be more interested in them. We have the ability to listen to them and to observe them and take pictures of them and, that kind of thing. So we still have a lot to learn about these guys, but we're learning some really interesting stuff that is shedding some light. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today. So fair warning, there's going to be quite a bit of us in here because obviously this is our main study animal.
Us being PacMam, by the way.
Yes. So that's, the Pacific Mammal Research here, that's our main study animal, and along with harbor seals. And so we have found out quite a bit in the last couple of years. And so we'll be chatting up our stuff as well. So, so for diet, so these guys, it's real interesting because they're along the coast, so that you're not going to find them diving really super deep. They feed on a lot of different taxa, different prey species, and but there hasn't been really a whole lot of studies. I think there is just 2 studies that were here in the Salish Sea for our animals in what they eat, and there's a few others from down in California, but they mainly eat fish that are 30 centimeters or less, right? So not very big, kind of foragey fish, if you think of that type of fish or size. So, and it kind of makes sense because they're small, right? They're the second smallest cetacean, so they're not going to eat giant things.
And they're swallowing them whole typically. So that's the other
Right.
thing to remember here is they're not masticating their food like these porpoises are grabbing a fish and just swallowing it. So
yeah, and if I had it with me, their teeth are, I knew their teeth were small, but
like
yeah, they're like
millimeters,
less,
like millimeters.
Yeah, millimeters, yeah. And sometimes only half of that tooth is above the gum line. So it's like, you got a millimeter. So, I mean, I knew they were small, but when I got them from the, Stranding Network for educational stuff, I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculously small. So they don't really have the ability to rip prey like orcas can, or some other even bottlenose dolphins and stuff can. So yeah, they are swallowing it whole. So again, that small fish are going to makes sense. So there were there's the two main studies that were done. Pacific herring is top on the list for both of them. Sardines are pretty common. Walleye pollock and Pacific hake are also very high. Like the herring and hake in our area are pretty the big ones. But they can eat sculpin, they can eat anchovies, perch. One had a lanternfish, which I thought was really cool. Euchelons, plainfin midshipman, blackbelly eelpout, and that one's interesting because depending on the study that you looked at, and what animals they were doing and what season it was, eelpout was higher than in another season or something like that. So the amount of these individual species can vary based on the season and their prey availability. Sand lance, also important, Pacific sand lance, rockfish, northern sculpin, sand dab, the coxcomb, mussel worms, which is probably just because it ate a fish that had a worm in it. They do eat squid, and they had there's some family of crustaceans in there as well, but that's kind of like probably not very, it's not very many of those, just it happens to be found when they did the necropsies. So they will eat squid and stuff like that, but mainly it's these smaller forage fish. So they will dive. They can dive for quite a few minutes, but usually their dive times are 1 to 2, 3 minutes. They're pretty quick. They're not diving real deep because they're not in super deep water. In our area, it's about 100-ish feet at the deepest part that they forage there. But the important thing to remember about these guys in diet is that they have a super high metabolism and they live in really cold waters. So what's interesting with them compared to other marine mammals is that they can't last as long without food. So, gray whales or humpback whales, they can last for quite a while without eating. And even dolphins can last quite a bit of time. But these guys, if they're already not doing well, they could die in as little as 3 days without food. So again, a super healthy animal probably could last a little bit longer, but that's kind of like, that's a really short time.
Yeah.
For marine mammals.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like a lot of that is normally conferred by your size, right? So the bigger you are, the more body fat you can maintain, and then you have those reserves. Exactly. And so these guys, you have the double whammy of the high metabolism and a small body size, so they can only carry so much blubber at one time and still move through the water.
Exactly. So they just don't have those stores to be able to use it longer. So they have to find consistent, reliable food resources and prey to eat. And on that, with reproduction, harbor porpoises can, depending on the area or the population, will reproduce every year or every other year. Their gestation is about 11 months. They nurse for 8 to 12 months. They usually mate and give birth in the summer months. So between May and as late as September, depending on the area, but usually July, August, that time frame. So if you're a female harbor porpoise, you can be lactating and pregnant for most of your life. Right? They start reproducing at 3 to 4 because their lifespan, for what we know, again, we don't really know, is anywhere from 8 to 24 years, which is a big range.
Right. Kind of a huge difference.
Right. So they have found some obviously as old as 24, but they say it's more likely that 14, 15 is probably their age range, which is starkly different from 50 or more for most dolphin species.
Right.
So they live life in the fast lane, as they say. So they start reproducing younger, because if you die younger, you got to start earlier. So at 3 to 4, they start reproducing. Females can be lactating and pregnant at the same time. The costs for lactation and pregnancy are intense, and especially lactation. It's the same thing for humans. You need like 300 extra calories a day for a human for pregnancy, and you need like 500 or 600 for lactation. So the females in particular really need to find those resources consistently and make sure that they can get the food that they need. So that bleeds into some of our behavior, where what we found is that, you know, these animals generally 30 centimeters or less, that's the fish that they're eating. Well, we had a volunteer that was out taking photographs a couple of years ago for us, and she documented them coming up to the surface and had a really large fish in its jaws sideways. So again, as Kat said earlier, they eat their food whole. So the fact that they're carrying it sideways is weird in the first place. You can't really swallow that way. But what we ended up, and we ended up documenting that a couple more times. I'm like, this is really weird. I've not seen this before. Salmon is not part of their diet here, as far as we knew from the diet studies. But lo and behold, we had some ichthyologists, because we are not fish people, take a look at the photographs we had, and they were like, yeah, that's pretty much going to be a salmon. There's really not much other thing it could be. And then one of the pictures, they were like, yeah, it's pretty sure it's pink. So, and these are like adult salmon, and it looks like, you look at the pictures and you're like, you cannot fit that down your gullet. There's no way. It's like half the size of you. But they're catching it. And so we documented that, and then we talked to our colleagues down in San Francisco Bay, and they were like, yeah, we've documented them chasing after these big fish, and they have what we call their stationary drone, the Golden Gate Bridge, super awesome. So they can just stare down at them below. And they were documenting them, same thing, going after these things, but they're American shad, which is an invasive species that was introduced about 50 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. But the same thing, they capture it and they hold it sideways, and then eventually at some point they reorient it and then try to swallow it. Because we're like, we didn't get to see that. We don't see them ingesting it in either of our studies, because they dive down and you can't see them. But we're like, it was foraging behavior. That's what they were doing. So we were like, well, if they are trying to eat it, do they choke? Can you choke on a fish that's too big for you to eat? So we looked with our colleagues into the stranding network, and we're like, yes, you can. You can choke on very large fish. And we documented over 25 cases of this since the 1930s. And sometimes the fish is so big, it goes all the way down to the stomach, and the tail is still sticking out of the mouth.
Because again, think about it, like these animals are 5.5, 5 feet long.
Right.
Like this is not a long porpoise.
And these American shad and salmon can get a couple feet long themselves.
Right, we're talking like big fish, yeah.
So what happens is that it goes down, because their esophagus and their trachea are separate, so because they have the blowhole up here and their eating hole over here. So when it goes in, it can dislodge the trachea, the goose beak was called, that comes down to connect to the lungs, and it basically dislodges that, and then they can't get it back out, and so then they suffocate and die. So what the really interesting thing was, because we were talking about females and their needs for cost, their needs for energy, and so we looked at, and for the ones that we knew the sex of, over 92% of them were female. I think only like one was a male.
Yeah,
and
there was like one male.
Yeah, and then like close to 87% were reproductively active. So it's really interesting, because that goes to like, if these animals are, if that life history, the pregnant or lactating females are the ones that are doing this, that are trying to do that risk, and then maybe paying the price for it, could that, that'll affect the population differently than if it was males doing it, because you just don't need as many males as you do females. So, so that was just really interesting. This one picture, we're like, oh, wow, that's okay. So now we know that at least on the Pacific side, they do attempt to eat salmon. And we did find one that got caught in a net up in Alaska that had it in its stomach. So it did eat it. And in the Atlantic, salmon has been, some salmon salmonoid species have been documented in their diet. But again, not the big ones, as far as we know. And so, you know, that's something new and interesting that we didn't know. And we were trying to actually look at that and compare it to the Atlantic side, because American shad is native over there. And do they just not try to eat those guys because they're like, oh, yeah, I know those guys aren't good to eat. They might get stuck. And our guys over here haven't learned that yet because this is an invasive species. We don't know. That's their kind of eating and behavior. They do need, I've saw a couple different places that it said they need up to 10% of their body weight a day in food. So which would make sense. Yeah, if they're 170 pounds, then you have to eat 17 pounds of food. Mm-hmm. How many forage fish do you have to eat to make 17 pounds of food, right? So like hundreds.
So again, that makes a lot of sense where you might want to try for a larger fish just to reduce that energetic amount.
Exactly. Bang for your buck. I can see one of these versus chasing 500 fish. That sounds great. And there are some other studies that have shown, you know, possibly continual feeding where they feed just all day because of the rates that they had for echolocation. And there was some debate on the what surrounded that study and how they collected the data. But it goes along with these guys need to eat a lot. How much they need to eat is debate, and then who they're eating changes how much you need to eat, right? The fat content and everything else in the different species will also play a role. So basically, we know this, we just found out this, we still need to know so much more about harbor porpoise diet because we obviously don't know enough. So on the other behaviors, we talked about reproduction. Basically, I'll go into kind of the social behavior. We don't know.
Spoiler alert. Here we go.
We don't know. We know nothing. They generally are more shy, quote unquote. They don't like boats in the way that dolphins or even other porpoises do. They don't really bow ride. They don't really wake ride. I'll put an asterisk on that. They don't approach boats like those other species do. They are more just like, I'm going to be over here doing my thing and you can just stay away and that'd be great. And so they have thought, because that, and also because they don't have whistles, at least that we know of, they don't have whistles that we know other species use to communicate with each other. They term them more asocial, right? They're only found in groups of 1 to 2, maybe 3, up to 10. Occasionally you'll see aggregations of 100 or 200. We still don't know why they do that. Maybe it's just a big party, who knows? But they're smaller groups. They don't seem to vocalize as much. So they think they're kind of asocial, but we found they do wake ride. So we've seen that multiple times a year in our study site. They just do it differently where the boat goes through. And then as the wake is, going, they're like, wee, and they do it a couple times and then probably go back to feeding, which is what they're needing to do most of the time. So they do. And I actually heard someone else on one of our discussions on Facebook with some other colleagues and stuff that they have seen a harbor porpoise bow ride, I think. I was like, ooh, really?
Right?
That's crazy. But so we do see them wake ride. We do see them leap out of the air. It's not that common, but we do. And we have realized that that's mating behavior, at least most of the time, that we see them completely come aerial out. And that's because we worked with our colleagues down in California, and they have that great footage from that stationary drone they have of documenting that behavior. And we've already talked about that in another podcast, I believe, but they do come out of the water. So a lot of the behavior that we say they don't do, I think is more because we haven't been out there to see it. And that's
right. And it's maybe a little more subtle too than we have, that we're used to with other cetacean species.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody's like, oh, they do this whole thing and it's obvious, like, well, maybe it's not.
Right.
I mean, when they leap out of the water, it's obvious, but.
And on the social thing too, if you haven't listened to last podcast, we actually, Cindy and I went through a new paper that was talking a little bit more about the social versus not social aspect of harbor porpoise hunting strategies as well. So make sure to check that one out if you want more information on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and we mentioned in that one too that there are some vocalizations now that they've documented that were not used for echolocation and finding food. They were social clicks. So again, it's these, they are social to some degree. What level they are compared to what we're used to seeing with dolphins is a whole nother story. But I don't think that they are asocial as they have been labeled for so long. It's just, we need to be out there to look at it and see and know what's going on. And that's why we're out there. And we've been out there for 7 years now. We've found out some pretty interesting information about these guys. So there's lots to be able to learn about them. But I think that covers most of their behavior. We don't really know their social structure because we just don't, their grouping pattern is different, I think, than dolphins. So we're still figuring that out. And by knowing the individuals, we can start to figure out, hey, does this guy come around with this guy all the time? Or is it, change or whatnot? And we don't know about their communities. So is the whole Salus Sea, for example, one big population? Or is it a bunch of smaller communities that interact with each other to some degree, but are basically self-contained? And that would be important in what Kat is going to talk about in status and how to protect them, because if there are smaller communities within a larger population, and that you have to manage those differently than you would if it was just one big giant group of porpoises.
Right.
So I think I didn't miss anything with behavior, did I? I think that
that's
covers
pretty
most
much
of
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to really highlight again for people that look, a lot of the reason we don't know this stuff about porpoises is, like Cindy said, first of all, people aren't out there looking, but also a lot of this stuff you do need to be tracking individual animals to learn. Right. And really, without using a physical tag, the only way that that we have to do that right now is photo ID. And so the fact that there have really been no photo ID studies until relatively recently is another reason why this is a lot of information that we just don't have at this point. So it's exciting. I feel like you said there's a lot still to learn, and having the technology now and having the eyes out there on the water, we are rapidly learning a lot more, but there's still just so much more we need to learn.
I think they really encompass the enigmatic species.
Yeah.
They're just like, we're going to be over here and you can't see anything that we do.
Yeah.
But it's really exciting if you catch us.
So speaking of which, let's get into the status part here. So harbor porpoises are considered a species of least concern for the most part. Their populations worldwide seem to be doing very well. The most frequent number that I was seeing reported was approximately 700,000 to 800,000 harbor porpoises worldwide.
Okay.
That number I think was a couple years old, so that might be a little bit of a different number, but somewhere in around that 700,000 to 800,000, it seems to be a pretty good ballpark. They are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act throughout their range and by the CITES Appendix 2 document as well. In our Washington inland water stock here, if you're wondering about our specific population that we here at PacMam study, that population was estimated at around about 11,000 at last count. These numbers are there are kind of ballpark numbers. So mostly they're getting these numbers from what they call aerial counts. So it's a snapshot in time when they literally take like photographs of images from a plane. And
then they do fancy math to figure out which ones they missed.
Right.
Because there's going to be a certain percentage that are, yeah. It's magic math. I mean, it's real math, but to me, it's like, you did it.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
We're not statisticians. So
no.
It's very impressive.
They make up for what they know that they're going to miss a certain amount based on dive times and just wave conditions and things like that. So they buffet all that in to make that estimate. Right,
exactly. So like I said, the majority of them are considered a species of least concern, except in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And these populations are listed as endangered and critically endangered, respectively. So the Black Sea population is listed as endangered. The Baltic Sea population is listed as critically endangered.
So the Baltic, I saw Baltic proper, and then there's Baltic. So is the Baltic proper like specifically that one section that is separate, or like I wasn't sure what the difference
of a population?
Yeah, I just saw that term a couple times where it was like, well, there's the Baltic Sea animals, and then in the Baltic proper.
Oh, interesting.
I wasn't sure. I'm not good with geography, especially not European geography.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not actually sure on that one. I wonder if maybe they're just in a specific part of the Baltic Sea.
That's what I'm thinking, is that there's a certain part that there's like the critically endangered. I said, like 500 animals left, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's pretty interesting. Like we already mentioned in the beginning, there are phenotypic differences, so appearance differences, and there are also genetic differences between these animals. What do you find?
It says the Baltic proper subpopulation of the harbor porpoise was categorized as critically endangered on the on the IUCN Red List. So I think they have just like I think they separate the Balt that from the rest of the area around there.
Okay.
The North Sea, because it's all the like North Sea harbor porpoises, and then they're like the Baltic proper ones over here. They're like in the Baltic, right over here in this section.
Right. Okay, yeah. That makes sense. And both of these, the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, they're obviously they're open to. I think they're both open to open water, but they're kind of more closed off.
So I know the Baltic definitely is, because it looks like it's kind of like there is it looks like it's closed off, but if you like go in, there is a little bit that goes to the sea that you can see, but it is very, very closed off.
Yeah.
It's like around Denmark.
Right. For
there's like there's a little tiny pathway between some of the islands there.
Yeah.
That you can get back out to the North Sea. The Black Sea, though.
The Black Sea it's open through Istanbul, but it's like a tiny channel.
Really?
Yeah. So it's connected to, I believe, is it the Mediterranean?
Let me the Mediterranean there. Okay, so I see Istanbul.
So it's
oh my God, you have to zoom in so far to see that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, unless you get channel. Yeah, unless you zoom in completely, it just looks like Istanbul is completely goes across.
So it makes sense as to why these populations versus other ones might be genetically isolated, right? So you actually have a little bit more of that geographic isolation. And it's thought that the Black Sea specifically, it's thought that that population became separated from other populations during the post-glacial warming of the Mediterranean Sea. It's quite interesting. And that population also specifically was hunted. So part of the reason that they're so in danger now is that they were hunted to near extinction in the 1930s. So it was between the 30s up to the 1980s. So actually very, very recently. And it's resulted in around about a 90% population decline.
Oh my God.
So you have this captive population in this sea that they can't get out of. I mean, very easily. Right. Makes total sense.
Yeah. I didn't realize they were hunted.
So that actually leads nicely into the threat section. So again, dedicated hunting effort is, historically has been a problem for some populations, not necessarily all, I don't think, but again, these ones that are more contained, right, it makes sense that they would be a source of food,
a food source for people.
And the other main threat is entanglement and bycatch. And actually, this is where I first heard about harbor porpoises. Actually, I grew up in Scotland and the UK, and bycatch is a huge problem, especially off the south coast of England. They're particularly susceptible to things like gill nets and trawling, anything that has that large net that's going through the water column. And also a lot of those are targeting those smaller forage fish that the porpoises are in and out trying to feed on. So that's really one of their main sources of mortality in today. There's still huge rates of bycatch of harbor porpoises.
Yeah, and that's an important difference between the US and Europe, though, because we don't really have that problem here anymore. Gill nets were banned, at least in most of the US. There are some still tribal fisheries that use them, but that's part of the reason why we think the porpoises came back in our area, because the gill nets were removed, basically. But it's still a big problem over in Europe, and because the porpoise is their main cetacean species over there, it's everywhere. They still have quite a big problem with that. So populations are different. The threats are going to be different depending on what population you're at.
Right, exactly. So this is the slight danger of talking about overall numbers of a population, a global population. They're not having the same experience.
Well, even within the North Sea, right? There's a paper that just came out about that, talking about the harbor porpoise decline in the North Sea. But the North Sea is a very big space, and so they say like there's some populations are going way down, these other ones are actually doing okay or possibly going up, and like why are these ones not doing good? Why were those ones doing okay? And do they mix? We don't know their migration. Some of them migrate offshore seasonally. Other ones we don't know. We don't know what happens here in the Salish Sea, if there's any kind of seasonal migration around the area. That's important stuff to understand in order to figure out which animals are being have which threats that are more important for their population.
Yeah, and I think it's one, I mean, the harbor porpoise in general is a great example of why fine scale research is needed, because there are so many differences with harbor porpoise populations when you look at the fine scale information. Like, oh, these guys like high tidal areas, these guys don't. Like these guys, you know, these guys forage all the time at night, these guys forage throughout the day. Like it just, they're very individualized or specific to the location that they're in, it seems.
Yeah, and on that, like talking about the foraging, it's very common for those tidal currents. So where you have those rips currents going through, that they use that barrier as to catch the fish. So it's very common in a lot of places, and even in our area that is, but they don't have the same relationship with those currents that they do in other places like in Europe that they've researched. Right? We didn't see a huge connection between tidal phase and as they did. And so it depends on the topography of the ocean. It depends on the porpoises. It depends on the fish. It depends on that whole ecosystem or environmental variables there. So that's an important one to have that distinction.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And when you do start diving into harbor porpoises specifically, you start to realize why that's so important. I think they're just a really great species to model why that's so important.
Exactly.
So pollution, obviously, like most marine mammals, that's another big problem for these guys. They are typically found around coastal areas and harbors, areas that have a lot of human activity. So they may be more inclined to get dosed with pollutants that are in the water, runoff from towns, from cities, from harbors. That can lead to disease susceptibility as well, for sure. And that's another issue for harbor porpoises. One of our colleagues is researching that in our area as well, looking at the disease occurrence and incidence in harbor porpoises in this area and how that's changing.
And there's that new fungal disease that popped up, and it was found more often in harbor porpoises than it was in any other marine mammal species here, even though they did find it in other ones, but they seem to be more susceptible to it.
Yeah, and then the other main threat for these guys, obviously, is just ocean noise. In addition to shipping noise and boat noise, which is the usual ones that we talk about, the other thing for harbor porpoises to remember is that a lot of, with the onset of a lot of renewable energy sources, and this is especially a big thing in the UK right now and in Europe, where they are installing a lot more marine renewable energy sources. What are the noise impacts of that on the harbor porpoise? The use of pingers or seal scarers or seal deterrents on, various fish pens and that type of thing that are like high-pitched pingers, basically, that are supposed to scare the seals away from these fish pens. That's right in the harbor porpoise vocalization range, which I'll talk about in just a second. So things like that, where just, when we're trying to make better decisions, we also have to look at how that impacts the animals in the environment that we are now choosing to impact in that different way. So.
Right. And that pile, like construction, like pile driving to create docks and things like that is also a big issue.
Yeah. So with that, let's get into some fun facts to wrap up here. Okay. So first of all, we already talked about why they're called the harbor porpoise specifically, but I did actually learn something on this one, because we're like, oh, okay, like we're going to probably know a lot of this and like do some fun research around the side, but this was actually really cool. We had some fun with this last night. So their Latin name is Faustina Fosena. The word Fosena in Latin actually means pig.
Oh, okay, that's what I thought. I thought that was right. Yeah.
So that's for all porpoises. So I think all porpoises are Fosena something.
Yeah, it's Fosina for the Atlantic. It's Fosina vomarina for the Pacific, and it's Fosina something else that I can't remember for the Baltic.
Right.
Or the Black Sea, sorry, not the Baltic, the Black Sea.
Black Sea, gotcha. Yeah. So Faustina itself actually means pig or pigfish. So when Cindy was talking earlier about how porpoises are sort of all generally like short and squat, apparently the people naming them back in the day thought so too. And so harbor porpoises are often called puffing pigs. So it's kind of a combination of that name plus the sound they make when they surface to breathe. So it's actually very loud.
It's very loud. And sometimes you're like, whoa, there's like an orca here or something. And then you see this little like 5-foot harbor porpoise go bloop. And you're like, and remember when they're surfacing too, they're not like all splashy. They're just like,
right. So the puffing pig is one fun colloquial name. Another one in Norway is nis or nisa, which is derived from the Old Norse word for sneeze, which I thought was amazing. And I think I actually, because I grew up on an island that's like relatively close to Norway, and I think we call them nisiks In Shetland, the colloquial term is Niesix. And I'm like, oh, dude, that's related to the Norwegian name. Had no idea.
Calling them sneezes. That's adorable.
Yeah. Isn't that adorable? I loved it. I thought that was great.
That's great.
And then one of the other terms that you might hear is a lot of times fishermen will refer to them as blackfish in our specific area. I'm not sure if that's generic or not, but.
Which is really confusing because everybody else calls the orcas blackfish. So when I first come up here, I'm like, okay, you're talking about orcas. Like, no, we're talking about porpoises. I'm like, but you can't call blackfish two different things.
Right. So let's talk about that for a second. So this is a colloquial name that's termed because they are dark and small and, you know, they're around the fish. There is actually a group of cetaceans that are generally known in the marine mammal world as blackfish that includes orcas, includes pilot whales, false killer whales, you know. So we're not talking about the scientific term blackfish. We're talking about just like a local term. So that's another fun.
Which is the reason why we have trouble with colloquial and local terms, because they can be very confusing.
So, and like I mentioned just a moment ago with the pingers, so the porpoises vocalize in the ultrasonic range, which means that as people, we typically can't hear their vocalizations in our normal hearing range.
Which is why we haven't been able to know much about their communication at all, because we couldn't even record it or hear it until recently.
So I mean, like Cindy said, for decades, they thought that the porpoises were just like, wow, these guys are crazy. They're not making any sound at all. This is bizarre. And then when our technology caught up, we're like, oh no, they are. We just couldn't hear it. And it is thought that one of the reasons perhaps for that ultrasonic vocalization range is that they are a small cetacean. So they are at risk of predation by things like orcas. And so that their harbor porpoise vocalization range is at the very top end of the orca's hearing range. So it's likely that co-evolved with predation attempts to try to have a way to still communicate potentially without your predator hearing.
Without being like, hey, I'm over here, come eat me.
Exactly. And on that note, we actually have a passive acoustic device out right now currently. And one of the aims of that is to hopefully record some harbor porpoise vocalizations on there, because it is a high frequency recorder. So
we're very excited for that. We're going to pick that up next week. So we'll see if we got anything.
Yeah, stay tuned for that. And actually, again, one I thought would be fun to finish on is porpoises are actually extremely intelligent. So they do have some harbor porpoises in captivity.
Yeah, they tend to not live as well as like that's the reason why bottlenose dolphins are there and everywhere is because they're hardy and they survive.
Yeah.
But so you tend to, but there are, like you said, have been a few that have survived long enough to get some interesting information.
Yeah, and so I mean, they have found that like they'll be able to be trained very easily. They can follow like multiple different commands and follow a set of instructions, and then retain that information, do various different tricks. So it's kind of interesting where so often they're sort of passed over as like the ugly cousin to dolphins, and it's like there's so much pun, but there's so much under the surface there, where it's like, see what I did. But it's just fascinating. I thought that was a really nice one to end on, where there's a lot more to the harbor porpoise than we thought for so many years.
Well, and it's kind of ironic for me to have ended up studying harbor porpoises, because back, I studied spotted dolphins and bottlenose dolphins at my previous research group with the Wild Dolphin Project. And my thing was, there's a difference between dolphins and porpoises. It's always been my thing of like making sure people understand that. Even my instructor from my marine mammal class, who was old school and kept calling it the bottlenose porpoise, which is not correct.
Because the collective name for dolphins used to be porpoise.
So they use that, and so that's totally fine. That was, but now you're a marine mammal teacher. You need to step up with the game of like, where are the languages at now? But that there is a difference between dolphins and porpoises. And what's thinking back now, I think is funny is that I did kind of put the porpoises as like, well, no, dolphins and porpoises are different. Porpoises are just, those guys over there that are like, whatever, they're more like, whatever. And that's the kind of thought I had about it. And then now, fast forward 20 years and now, I did my research on the dolphins, and we ended up coming out here and then realizing how much more to them there is, and they are intelligent, and they are cousins to the dolphins. They're not the, just these little guys over here that don't mean anything. They do have some sociality. They are intelligent, and we just haven't bothered to pay attention until recently.
Yeah.
So that's why we're here.
Exactly. So if you are interested in learning more about what we do, we don't really talk a ton about our work specifically on this podcast because we want to keep it more broadly educational about a lot of different things. But if you are interested, make sure to check out our website, which is www.pacmam.org, not the fun game. And check out our social media, which is all just at Pacific Mammal Research. So we're on Instagram and Facebook, and obviously, hopefully you're listening to this podcast. So that's a great start.
And we have our YouTube channel that has quite a bit of these podcasts, as well as some other educational content. And we are continually trying to put more and more on there for everybody to learn from.
Yeah, and we have on our website, we also do have a section for a gift shop. So if you want to purchase any fun goods from there, or if you want to continue to support our work, learning more about this animal, hopefully this podcast has inspired you as to why that's so important. So feel free to check out the donate page on our website as well.
Exactly. All right. Well, the harbor porpoise. So yay, harbor porpoises. We are the harbor porpoise supporters and are going to raise awareness of these super cute, super awesome animals that we need to learn more about. So make sure that you keep an eye out for the next month. Usually is towards the end to the beginning of the month. Every other episode we do a marine mammal highlight, and you get to choose which one we do. So it should be the spotted dolphin against somebody else this time. So we'll see who wins that battle royale. And next week, I think we'll probably do a general review, but I think in the near future, in kind of, I think September-ish, we're going to start having some interviews with some of our colleagues here, which is going to be really exciting. So keep an eye out for that. But that's it for us. So we will see you next time. Bye. Bye. This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.